The arrest and trials of Jesus stand as the greatest travesty of justice in history. It at least is the greatest act of mercy and redemption ever known. Please join me today as we examine the first trial of Jesus, the religious trial by the Jewish leadership, and how it was unjustly carried out, and even the greater lessons that we learn about the love and grace of God. As we continue our study, we will find 6 different trial proceedings against Jesus. Some describe these proceedings as 6 different trials, but there are really only 2 separate trials, each of which proceeds in 3 separate segments. First, there will be a religious trial, which is the Jewish trial, and then there will be the civil trial, which is the Roman or Gentile trial. Today we will examine the religious or the Jewish trial. Now, it would be very helpful before we begin if you get your copy of the list of rules that were broken. Now, if you don't have those, we covered those in lesson number 3 of this series. Our redemption draweth nigh. Let's begin by reading John 18, verses 12 through 14. Now, for the sake of time, and because we're going to be looking at a lot of different passages in the 4 Gospels, I have these passages written out before me. So feel free to stop the video and read the passages as we come to them. So we'll start in John chapter 18, beginning with verse 12. Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Now, having arrested and bound Jesus, where do they take him? Well, the first place that they take him is to Annas. Now, bringing him before Annas for trial violates the 4th rule in our list. There were to be no trials before the morning sacrifice, and this one occurs before the morning sacrifice. But even more importantly, who was Annas? Annas served as high priest from the year 7 to the year 14 AD, so that was prior to this particular point. This all happens around 30 to 33 AD. So after that, he was deposed by the then Roman governor, Valerius Gratus. But although he was deposed, he was still able to maintain control of the high priesthood because he was followed in succession by 4 of his own sons. Then followed by his son-in-law, and towards the end of his life by his grandson. That sound familiar? It is important to note that he was a Sadducee. Now, as a Sadducee, he controlled the business ventures of the temple, like the changing of the money and the selling of sacrifices. And when Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers and drove out the animals from the temple at the first and last Passovers of his public ministry, it was the business venture of Annas that he was overthrowing. So Annas had his own private grudge against Jesus. Now, Annas questioned Jesus. So let's continue reading in verses 19 through 23 of John's Gospel, chapter 18. And as we read these verses, notice both the nature of the questions and the response of Jesus. So in verse 19, the high priest then asked Jesus, now that's referring to Annas, the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. And Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always meet, and in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by Jesus struck struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, "Do you answer the high priest like that?" Well, Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, do not. Why do you strike me?" Now, folks, that always has been kind of a strange passage to me, but I think you'll understand how these events happen and why they happen like they do in a moment. So, what was the subject of Annas' questions? Well, he questioned Jesus about two things. First, about his disciples, so that he could find something to incriminate them about, and second, about his teachings, so that he could incriminate Jesus. Now, does Jesus answer his questions? Well, no. And why not? Well, because under Jewish civil law, dealing with trials, Jesus is not responsible to answer the question. They are responsible to produce the 2 or 3 witnesses that would bring the accusation against him. So he points out to them, since everything he taught publicly. If he said anything amiss or blasphemous, they should have no trouble producing the 2 or 3 witnesses that they need to condemn him. It was right for him to make this response. But for this response, he's beaten, which also breaks another rule. Now, this is the first of several beatings that he will receive on this night. So as we begin to see here, and as we will continue to see throughout these proceedings, they are confused and disorganized. Well, why would they be so disorganized? Well, the reason that they are confused and disorganized is that they did not anticipate having to conduct the religious trial on this particular night. The original conspiracy included waiting until after the Passover. But now Jesus has forced their hand, and they have acted before they are ready. So their purpose for the Jewish trial is to establish a religious charge against him. And the issue that they want to bring up is blasphemy. Now, Jesus is not only pointing out to them that they are responsible to bring witnesses against him, and that they should have no difficulty in finding them. There is another implication in his response to them. Why does he emphasize how publicly he taught with the words, "And I spoke nothing in secret"? Because this stands in contrast to this trial. He said nothing in secret, but this trial is being conducted in secret. Therefore, they are breaking rule number 5 on our list. Now, what was the outcome of this trial before Annas? Well, the end product of the first stage of the Jewish trial is that they were unable to produce a specific charge against him. So what do they do next? Well, next, they bring him before Caiaphas. So let's read John chapter 18, beginning with verse 24. Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, who was Caiaphas? Well, Caiaphas is the son-in-law of Annas, and Caiaphas served as high priest from the year 25 until the year 36 AD. Now, notice Annas is also called the high priest. That's kind of like a former president is called president. It's the same concept. So Caiaphas now is the acting high priest, and he served from the year 25 until 36 AD. And this trial takes place in the midpoint of his high priesthood in AD 30. Now, let's turn to Dr. Luke's account in Luke 22, verse 54, to see how the story continues. Now, when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down to gather, Peter sat among them. So where was Caiaphas when they brought Jesus to him? Well, he was at his home. And the scene behind me are the steps are what are considered to be the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, a Catholic church has been built on this site, and I'll give more details about this in a later study. Now, taking Jesus to Caiaphas' house breaks rule number 6 on the list, because Sanhedrin trials could only be conducted in the hall of judgment of the temple compound, not the high priest's home. Now let's turn to Mark's account and read Mark 14, verse 53. And in verse 53 it says, "And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes." So here's the scene. All the chief priests, together with the elders and the scribes, were there with the high priest. These were the members of what we know as the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin was comprised of 71 members carefully divided along party lines. 24 seats went to the chief priests, and all 24 chief priests were Sadducees. And Mark says that they were all there. Now, another 24 seats went to the elders, and the 24 elders were Pharisees. But now we know that not all the Pharisees were there. Nicodemus was not there, nor was Joseph of Arimathea. Now, 22 more seats went to the scribes, and all 22 scribes were also Pharisees. The last seat of the Sanhedrin went to the high priest, who was also a Sadducee. So the majority vote was by the Pharisees, but the proceedings were conducted by a Sadducee. Now, it was not necessary to have all 71 members there, but it's important to remember that they had to have a minimum of 23. So if you had a minimum of the members there, according to Jewish law, with that number, 11 votes would be sufficient to acquit. But 13 votes would be necessary to convict. Now, you see, conviction had to be by a majority of 2, not just 1. Now, we're not told how many of the 71 members were there, but Mark does tell us that all the chief priests were there, and we know that not all 71 members were there because later in the Gospels, as we've mentioned already, we notice that Nicodemus was not there, nor was Joseph of Arimathea. So the most that they would have had there would have been 69, and there could have been fewer. We now come to the second stage of the Jewish trial. That's the trial before Caiaphas and this group that is gathered of the Sanhedrin. So how does this trial begin? Well, Mark describes it in chapter 14, beginning with verse 55 through 59. Now the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. Then some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple, made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands.' But not even then did their testimony agree." So the trial begins by trying to obtain false testimony against him. Therefore, they were breaking rule number 7 on the list. They were to begin with the defense and then the accusation. The witnesses against Jesus should not have been called at this time. So notice their disarray and their disorganization. The chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus. Now, why don't they have their witnesses ready? Well, because they weren't intending to have the trial on this night, but after the feast of Passover. Notice also that it is the whole council that is acting here. All are trying to put him to death. This breaks rule number 8 on the list. Now, all could argue in favor of acquittal, but all may not argue in favor of conviction. Now, they bring one false witness after another, trying to find 2 who will say the same thing, but although they had many false witnesses, they were all disqualified because their testimonies were inconsistent. Finally, they find 2 men who seemed to say the same thing, and they stood up in the court to give their testimony. But as Mark points out in verse 59, not even their testimony was consistent. Now we can see the discrepancy in their statements by comparing Mark and Matthew. In verse 61 of Matthew's account, he quotes one of them as saying, "This man said, 'I am able to destroy the temple.'" How does that differ from Mark, verse 58? Or Mark quotes these witnesses as saying, "I will destroy this temple." So did he say, "I will do so," or did he say, "I'm able to do so"? One is a statement of ability, The other is a statement of actual intent. Now, it was a small discrepancy that disqualified the last two witnesses, but failure to have witnesses that agree should have resulted in his release at that point, because this would violate rule number 9 of the list. There were to be 2 or 3 witnesses, and their testimony had to agree in every detail. Now, all of this exasperates Caiaphas. So what does he do in response to this? Well, we find that answer in Mark chapter 14, verses 60 through 61. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" But he kept silent and answered nothing. Now, by asking Jesus to respond now, when they did not have 2 witnesses presenting the official charge, he breaks rule number 10. There was to be no allowance for the accused to testify against himself. And in keeping with Jewish civil rights, verse 61 says, he kept silent. Jesus did not have to respond at this stage. Now, this frustrates Caiaphas even further. And we go to Matthew's account, and we find, but Jesus kept silent. And the high priest answered and said to him, "I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "It is as you said." Now, Mark uses the I am terminology. Jesus, in Mark, he says, "I am." "Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Now, what Caiaphas asks him at this point reveals 2 things that he knows. What are they? Well, he clearly understood who Jesus claimed to be. Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. And secondly, he knew who the Messiah was supposed to be. The Messiah was supposed to be the Son of God. Now here he puts Jesus under oath. "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." Now, by Jewish civil law, if you are placed under oath, you must respond. So Jesus does respond. And he answers the question with, "I am," meaning, yes, I am the Messiah, the Son of God. Then what does he add? They will see him seated at the right hand of the power, and the power would be God the Father. They will see him come also in the clouds of heaven. Now, why did he add this to his answer? Well, they do not believe him at this time. But there will come a day when they will know the truth of what he claims because of these 2 things. They will see him seated at the right hand of God the Father, and they will see him come in the clouds of heaven. And unfortunately, this they will see from the pit of hell. Now, several things happen in rather quick succession at this point. Matthew 26:65 goes on to describe what happens next. It says that Caiaphas tore his robes. Now, by tearing his robes, he breaks rule number 11 in our list, which is a rule taken from the law of Moses, Leviticus 21, verse 10. So what's the charge against Jesus? Well, that he has blasphemed. Who's made the charge? Well, the high priest, who is the judge in this case. So the charge originates with the judge. Now that breaks rule number 12. Charges could not originate with the judges. They could only investigate charges brought to them. Furthermore, because the charge is blasphemy, it breaks rule number 13. The accusation of blasphemy was only valid if the name of God itself was pronounced. In other words, Yahweh instead of Elohim, which he did not do at this trial. Now, what does he add immediately after making the charge? He goes on to add, what further need do we have of witnesses? And he doesn't have any witnesses anyway because they were all disqualified. So he is asking for a condemnation strictly on the basis of what Jesus just said. Therefore, he violates rule number 14. A person could not be condemned on the basis of his own words alone. Now, in verse 66 of Matthew's account, we find that they're going to break 5 rules at once. They go ahead and pronounce him guilty, breaking rule number 15. The verdict could not be announced at night, only in the daytime. Furthermore, because this is a capital offense, they also break rule number 16. In cases of capital punishment, the trial and guilty verdict could not occur at the same time, but must be separated by at least 24 hours. Furthermore, it was done by acclamation, which breaks rule number 17. Voting for the death penalty had to be done by individual count, beginning with the youngest, so the young would not be influenced by the elders. And Mark adds a small detail that Matthew omits. In the last part of verse 64, in Mark's account, we see that they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Now, what's the significance of the word all? Well, it was a unanimous decision. Now, remember, by Jewish law, Jesus should have been released at this point. Why? Because failure to release him would violate rule number 18. There could not be a unanimous decision for guilt. A unanimous decision for guilt shows innocence, since it is impossible, according to Jewish thought, that 23 to 71 men could agree to anything without plotting. Now, they also pronounced the sentence at this point, adding that he is worthy of death, which would also break rule number 19. The sentence could only be pronounced 3 days after the guilty verdict. Now, as we see in Mark chapter 14, verse 65, some began to spit at him, and to blindfold him, and to beat him with their fists, and to say, "Prophecy." And the officers received him with slaps in the face. Here they break rule number 20. Judges were to be humane and kind. And also, according to rule number 21, a person condemned to death was not to be scourged or beaten before the execution. So during this night, Jesus is physically mistreated several times. The first time occurred at the trial before Annas, when he was struck by an officer. Now here at the trial before the Sanhedrin, he is mistreated for the second time. And here he suffers 3 great indignities under Jewish law. It says some of them hit him with their fist. And hitting someone with their fist was punishable by a fine of 4 denarii. Now, 1 denarius was equivalent to 1 day's wages. So 4 denarii was 4 days' wages. Even more insulting is to be hit with the palm of the hand. And they slapped Jesus. That was punishable by a fine of 200 denarii, or 200 days' wages. And the third thing he suffers is that some of them spit into his face. That is even more insulting, and was punishable by a fine of 400 denarii, or 400 days' wages. And while he suffers these 3 high indignities under Jewish law, one thing is certain: no one was fined for their actions that night. The last thing to notice in this section is that this trial happens to fall between the first night of Passover and the first day of Passover, and it is therefore violation of rule number 22. No trials were allowed on the eve of the Sabbath or on a feast day. So as you can see, they have broken all 22 rules on our list. Now, there is a lot more for us to learn. So please join us next time as we look at the events that lead up to the Roman or civil trial of the Lord Jesus. So until next time, God bless and shalom.